Hi, Andreas Møller here, and today I want to talk about Lighthouse, which is a tool built by Google to analyze your website or web app's performance, accessibility, SEO, etc. It's got a ton of features and it's really, really helpful. So if you're building a website, web apps, especially if you're doing this as a professional, it's just like a core tool in your toolbox to make sure that everything is as it should be, right? So right here, I've got our website loaded up in Chrome. So Lighthouse is built into Chrome. It's completely free to use. And you can get to it by going to View and then Developer, and then you can find it here under Developer Tools. You can also press Option Command I to open it up, right? And so, right, when you open this, you might be on any one of these tabs. You want to go to the one called Lighthouse, right? And so what Lighthouse does is it runs a test against your site, and you can see we're going to do that now. We're going to say, I want you to run a test emulating a desktop, and I want you to test for all these categories, and I'm going to run analyze page load. And what Lighthouse then does is that it's going to go and reload your page actually a few times, and measure the performance of it. It's going to look at the content coming back and run a bunch of tests against things like accessibility, best practices, SEO optimization, etc. And it's going to generate you this report that essentially shows you how well you're doing. So there are 4 different categories here: performance, accessibility, best practices, and SEO. And we're going to go through all of them. We're going to start with performance, and we're going to spend most time there because performance is quite different than the other 3, right? Accessibility, best practice, and SEO are essentially just a set of rules that Chrome or Lighthouse will check against, and you kind of either pass them or fail them, and the more you pass, the higher you score, right? And so it's a lot easier to optimize for. It basically is, and understand for that matter. You basically just look at what it tells you, and then you basically does what it says to fix it. Like, it's usually really easy to do. We don't have a lot here because we monitor our website for these things and make sure we're actually doing well all the time. But in a minute, I'm gonna run the test against our editor, where we haven't done nearly the same level of optimization, especially for things like SEO, right? Because SEO doesn't matter in the editor. It's not supposed to be Google indexed, right? But then we can go and see how that works, right? First, we're going to talk about performance. And the performance score in Lighthouse is a score that actually is calculated as a combination of several measurements, right? So if we hover this, we can see that we've got these, 5 different categories. We can also see them down here below, right? And if we click expand view, we can see a little bit more details. So I'm going to go through those, explain what they are and why they're important. So, and maybe before we do this, there might be a valid question of like, but why, what are these things and why do we have them, right? Because the fundamental problem is, if you want to measure your website's performance, like, what are you actually measuring, right? You could say load times, the time it takes to load, but then what counts as load? Is it the time it takes to download the HTML? But then when it's done doing that, it's going to load a bunch of other stuff. Is it the time it takes to load everything, right? Because that could take a long time and actually might not really be relevant for the user experience. Because right now I'm looking at like this above the fold part, right, of our site. But technically, if it was loading stuff that was on other parts of our website, that wouldn't really impact the user's load experience, right? And the whole point of Lighthouse and these things, which are called Web Vitals, that's the name they've given these measurements. The whole point is to get them as close to the user's experience of loading. Like, what is it like for the user, and less what are some measurement that we think is nice. So I can say, how fast does it take to load the HTML document from the server? And that's a fine thing to look at, but it doesn't really indicate that something might actually be loading for the user, right? Like that's not actually the user's experience of that site, or at least it very often wouldn't be, right? You still need to load the CSS, you need to load the JavaScript. Sometimes that JavaScript needs to fetch some data before it even starts rendering. Like there's a lot of different ways you can build web apps, and so the Web Vitals here are a way to measure as close as we can to user experience. Now they're not perfect, because I don't think maybe you can do perfect, and they actually change over time. So these are the current set of vitals, but there have been other measurements that's been used before, right? And they're constantly evolving to get the best possible idea of what a good objective measure of user of load time performance from the user perspective actually is. So let's dive into what they are, right? The first one is called the first contentful paint. And it says here, it marks the time at which the first text or image is painted. So another way, from you click the link or type in the URL and hit enter, from that moment until the first thing from this website is rendered on screen. That doesn't mean it's done, it just means the first actual like text, image, as anything like that is painted on the screen. That is the first contentful paint. One popular example of sort of explaining this is like you might have seen a lot of websites where the first experience is like a loading screen. It'll say, oh, I'm loading this wonderful experience, and then later it actually swaps that, it removes the loading screen and actually shows the wonderful experience, right? The first contentful paint here will generally be the time it takes from you load the site till you see the load screen. Now the next measurement over here, the largest contentful paint, is measuring how long until you then actually see the content, right? The thing you were going to see, right? And this is kind of tricky to measure exactly, to be honest, because again, the problem is that it's not always easy to understand what the site is supposed to be about, or what the user would actually cares most about on the site. So the best sort of metric there is right now is saying, well, it might be the thing that's the biggest. So what it actually does is saying, well, you have a site like this, pick out what is the biggest element on screen and how long did it take to finish render that. And then it used that as an estimate of what is the user load experience going to be, right? And again, this is not a perfect metric, but it's a pretty good indicator, and it's something it's worth generally optimizing for, because it usually aligns pretty well with what that user's experience of the load time is going to be, right? And larger, like it literally just actually pick one. Let's see if we can find the. We can actually go here. There's a performance tab that shows some of the same metrics here. And so with large contentful paint, it actually shows what the element is here. So I can hover and say, okay, it's the edge one, it's the heading one on it, right? Which is absolutely the most important thing I want to see on the website. So in our case, it was spot on in understanding what the largest contentful paint was, right? Let's go back to our Lighthouse tab here, right? Got 3 more. We're going to go a little bit faster because honestly, these are... maybe not always the ones you end up optimizing for anyway, right? So the total blocking time is basically just a measurement of how much work is the browser doing while loading this site. And by load, I mean like on the CPU, right? So when loading a site, there's a lot of things that have to happen one after another. That can't, like a lot of things can happen in parallel, but also a lot of things can't actually happen in parallel. So for example, you can't necessarily render the content if you're waiting for a script to be evaluated, some JavaScript to be evaluated. And so what this does is it measures essentially how much time is the browser just waiting for the CPU to finish the task until it can go on to the next thing of like loading, painting the next thing, right? And this should ideally be in different, like split up in different tasks, and each task should not take more than 50 milliseconds, because when the task, if there's a lot of tasks and they're small, it's not so big a problem because you can interject like a user interaction, right? But if it's one task and it's big and the CPU is doing a lot of work, like the site's gonna feel really janky. You probably experienced that where you're like loading a site and then there's like a point where it seems like you can do something, but then you have to wait like a second more until it actually works. And that's what total blocking time here measured. And the very short version of that is that if you have a high total blocking time, you're loading too much JavaScript onto your page, and you're probably loading it too early. So the most common thing here is you propped a bunch of analytics script into your header that are measuring all sorts of things for a lot of different reasons, and what they actually end up doing is really hurting your user experience of your website. So you can either delay those scripts, load them a bit later, or in I think very often consider how many you actually need. Like, do you absolutely need this script that does this thing? Is it worth the hit you're taking to performance to include it, right? For cumulative layout shift, this is kind of a funky one, right? And the 0.001, it's kind of hard to really visualize what it means. But the basic, like the actual score, right? But what it basically means is when things are painted on the screen, how much do they move around? And we've probably all tried this really annoying experience where you're clicking on, where you're trying to click on a link on a page, but it hadn't loaded the image just above. And when that image starts loading, it shifts all the content away and you actually end up clicking on the wrong thing, right? I think everybody has tried that at some point. It's incredibly frustrating. And what the CLS, or cumulative layout shift, does is that it basically measures how much does that happen. And you're allowed to do a little bit. There are things that change a little bit in size. Like as you load maybe a different font, you might have like a slight jitter. In some kinds, that's on purpose. So a little bit is generally to be expected as it's calculating the layout and different things come in. But too much of it becomes a really bad user experience. So therefore, they have this measurement of basically how much the things shift around. And the final one here is speed index. So here it says how quickly the content of a page is visually populated. And this is, again, it's kind of hard to exactly visualize how this time is calculated. But the way you can think about it is if you look at this list of screenshots down here, what happens is when you run Lighthouse, it actually captures a video of the load time, and it'll then do a frame-by-frame comparison of the visual difference between each frame. And basically the speed index is an estimate of like how quickly does it take to get to something that looks like the final form, right? So it compares the visual difference in each frame and figures like, okay, how quickly do we get towards what the page is actually supposed to look like? And again, in that scenario where you have like a loader first and then eventually replace it with the content, you're going to see a potentially relatively low first contentful paint, then a relatively large contentful paint, largest contentful paint, LCP, right? Because the reason you put in a loader is because it wasn't very fast, right? So that's probably why there was a loader to begin with, right? And then you'll see a relatively large one. Total blocking time, in these cases, it tends to be because it's loading a lot of JavaScript. In that case, that probably is fairly high. And speed index is probably also going to be fairly high because the visual difference on the app is going to be a lot, right? What we often don't see is the cumulative layout shift because this only calculates if the same element moves, right? So if I put in a heading like this one and then I move it somewhere else, that is a layout shift. If I replace a spinner with some other content, that is not considered a layout shift. It's like the same things that's visually moving around, right? Right. So that's kind of like what Lighthouse does, other than measuring it and giving you a nice feeling of having lovely green circles and all that. What really makes it fantastic is it also runs these diagnoses and actually tells you what you need to fix, right? So I can see like we're doing pretty well. 94 is pretty good for performance. But that doesn't mean that there's not things that could be done better, right? And one thing we see here is where we're doing comparatively worse compared to all the other categories, this largest contentful paint. And it'll actually go and tell us what is that element, right? Oh, that's the H1. And then we can go and figure out, well, why does that take longer to paint or so long to paint? Is there anything we can do to optimize, right? So it does a lot to really help you. How do I make my app better? And gives you quite clear sort of pointers to what to do, right? In this case, it's saying, hey, there's a render blocking resource. And render blocking here means like when loading this, I can't continue loading the page. And this is actually quite important in this case, because the CSS that we're loading here is actually for this editor that is not open by default. So it really didn't need to block the rest of the page. Something we could literally go and fix right now, and potentially actually saving us a fair bit, right? So that would absolutely be worth fixing. Accessibility is essentially how good is your page for people who have special accessibility needs. This can be people who are have a hard time seeing different colors, like a colorblind. It can be people who have a hard time visually seeing low contrast. So it's sort of assessed like when you put this text on top of this background, is the contrast between those big enough that we consider them to be accessible, right? And if you reduce the contrast too much, so you have too much of the same color, like we don't have that obviously by definition, but if you reduce this, make this text darker, you get to a point where it says actually like I can't read that text based on this like threshold. You should go and improve that. And again, it'll just tell you that, like it really does give you almost all the answers, right? Or at least very clearly shows you where to address that. And it also have things that it can't really test reliably. So like make sure that everything where you can interact with the keyboard is actually also something that can be focused. Or interactive controls, anything that you can click should also somehow be accessible through keyboard interaction, right? But it's saying I can't really validate that easily, so you'll have to do it, right? But it does then also give you a link to learn about more of that, right? And that's kind of the whole power of Lighthouse, is that you really can just run it and then follow its instructions and usually sort things out. Like I've known people who are like working as consultants, and they say like so much of their job is just running a Lighthouse score and telling people what it found, and then people are impressed with how knowledgeable they are, right? Oh, you knew all these things. And like, yeah, but it was just like an automated test, right? So this is such a useful tool for anyone building web apps and websites. Now, best practices, there's a few things. These are generally just generally doesn't necessarily affect the user sometimes, but a lot of times it's more things like, hey, you don't log things to the console, etc., right? And the last one is SEO, right? And this is things like, do you have the right description, header set, all these things? Do you have a H1 on the page so it's clear what's going on? All these things. And again, it's just a bunch of checks. So you can literally just go run this against your site and it'll tell you what you need to fix. Like you don't need to be an SEO expert for a lot of these things. It will just tell you what do you need to do here. Now that's not the whole story of SEO. We have a course if you want to learn more. But it really does take you a long way, right? So I said that we would take a look, because I think right now, as I say, these are pretty good scores. So let's go and try, we'll go to Toddle.new, which will create a new project. And load up our editor here, right? And we'll try to run the same score. Like it should be noticed, you can also run like a test on mobile. With mobile for performance, they have slightly different thresholds for what's considered good. They're generally more forgiving, but they will also throttle the connection. So it mimics a slow 4G mobile connection, right? So if you're sitting, like right now, I'm sitting on a good Wi-Fi connection, it's gonna load fast, but if I run the mobile, it'll be actually throttled down to that speed. But I'm still gonna do desktop because our editor doesn't really work on a mobile phone. So we're gonna run that again. And it's gonna give us a report for this. And of course, like the Toddle editor is not optimized for SEO, right? That's not, we don't want Google to index the editor, right? We want them to index all our other pages. So you're gonna see a lot more things here. And also it's just a much larger project. There's no way we can get the same kind of load time performance as our website. So we are gonna take a big hit, we know that. And we'll probably also see a bunch of other issues simply because it's a much larger project. I don't actually know for sure what the result's going to be. So it's a little bit exciting. Yeah. And you can see like Lighthouse does these like facts factoids, if you will, whenever it loads, and it's all a little bit with this sort of like, do consider performance, because a lot of people have slow internet connections. It does matter, even if it's fast on your screen, kind of thing. It's kind of a little bit heavy-handed sometimes, but I do kind of like it, right? Right. So yeah, now we got our report, and immediately we can say, okay, we took a fairly big hit on performance, right? 76 is not 94. And we can go and hover and see what was actually the things that were affected. Well, our cumulative layout shift was not so bad, which is actually quite, I thought that was a bit surprising. And total blocking time wasn't too bad, because while there is a lot of logic in Toddle, we are a little bit conscious about how we load it at what time, especially for the editor. So we still have a pretty good score there, right? The speed index is not great. The first Contentful paint is also not great. And the LCP here, largest Contentful paint, was significantly slower. Now, that's something we would expect, because it is just loading a lot more stuff. It can't server render everything. In this case, it actually can't server render most of the things, because it has to wait for a connection after. So we are going to get significantly worse scores here, right? And we can it'll start saying things like here, well, actually your server response time wasn't great, more render logging response, and a lot of different things, right? We have a lot more JavaScript being loaded, right? On best practices, we can sort of look at accessibility. We can see there's actually a few cases here where it says buttons do not have accessible names. Now, I don't have an excuse for why they don't have that, because they absolutely should have that in our editor as well as the website, right? So that's something for us to go and look at fix, so we can see, it's that button right there. Okay, that's a fairly easy one to go and give that a label, right? And it's basically saying, because it's an icon button, like if you're vision impaired, like there's just no way for you to know what that button would do. Now, it is very hard to use Toddle if you can't see it, but you still want to do these things right, because there's a lot of gray area in between where like a user might be hard at seeing but can still see. It's just that it's not like, especially these, we have fairly small icons for things like this, the help icon and the sort of like refer friend button down here, right? And if someone's not at perfect sight, that might be really hard to see. So it totally makes sense, this label on it. There's a lot of people using assistive technologies that aren't actually blind. They're just slightly impaired, right? So these things do really matter for quite a lot of your audience, right? We have exactly the same thing here. There's a link that doesn't have a proper name on it, just an icon. That's also no good. Also certainly something we should fix, right? So we can see here in this project, it being a lot larger, there are things that did slip, and we can then now go and address. And it's really easy to do that, right? Because I mean, all I need to go into the Toddle and find this button and give it a ARIA label that says, home menu, right? These are not hard things to fix. The hard things was finding them in the first place, and Lighthouse does all that for us, right? And I mean the same thing with best practices, and we just get this list of issues we can address, right? So one more thing I want to show is that you can, of course, as I said, run it. Let's go page speed. Web.dev. I'll just go. Whoops. Here. So you can run Lighthouse directly from Chrome. You can also use this pagespeed.web.dev, and we can go and run this against like Toddle.dev and do an analysis here. And it does essentially exactly the same thing, but it does it from a central Google-owned server. It runs both the mobile and the desktop. And it'll also show you things like common scores. So like a lot of people using Chrome browsers actually run this, and like a lot of people are doing like accessing your site from all over the world, and Chrome actually captures a lot of this anonymous information and sort of combines it into this. So what I'm seeing here is both my actual score from the diagnosis I just ran, which is actually in this case a little bit better than last time we did it, but very comparable, right? And then I'm also seeing, but what are people actually experience, right? And this is really useful, and this is based on quite a lot of tests that different users with different devices actually done, right? Various desktop devices, latest 28-day collection period, right? So this is a really good tool to like do use Lighthouse in your browser, especially when you're working through these issues and optimizing. It's by far the fastest way. But go and check out PageSpeed's Insight as well and try it there, because you might sometimes find that if you're only ever testing on desktop on your office Wi-Fi, real user experiences can sometimes differ a bit. Like not everybody has like your mega gigabit Wi-Fi connection, right? Very last thing is that if you want to learn more about all these things and what they mean, like from any report you can go here, but web.dev is a really, really useful website. And like, first of all, it's got a lot of interesting articles about web development. You don't have to be a coder to get anything from this. You can also go and read about each of these web vitals, how they're calculated, why these were chosen, and like how to fix it, right? There's so much content here about how to make better website, how to make better web apps that can be used. And it doesn't matter if you're coding your websites, if you're using a visual editor or no code, whatever you're doing, like all this is still really valuable information, and it still really matters for your end users, right? So I hope this was informative. I hope this maybe opened up some eyes to some of the toolings you can use to improve the sites and applications you're building. And again, it's totally free to use. There's really, it takes maybe 5 minutes to check, right? So there's no reason not to do that. If you're delivering on a client project, like before you hand it over, just go and run it, see, is there just a few things I missed that I could improve? It's always going to be worth it, right? It always makes you look good as a freelancer or someone who has an agency, or if you're building a product, right? Like those little things can really do a ton for the end user experience. Thank you very much for watching. Remember to like this video if you did like the video, or and especially subscribe for future content. Thank you.